why remain indifferent? Why not fundamentally change? Is it because people really want freedom from freedom? Is it because they're scared to death of what it means to walk the Siddhartha road? Is it because they don't really want truth, justice, and freedom? Now that's a very hard question and controversial one to ask, but everyone here should be asking it.
Yeah, well, this is an event put on by Karen Sawyer, who very kindly featured me in her book, Dangerous Man, The Dangerous Man, and that was a privilege, and felt like reciprocating to come to her. I think this is a second event or she's put on a conference in the beautiful city of Bath, and I didn't do a talk per se, but I did the introduction, and it's just a great opportunity to meet my heroes like Ralph Ellis and scholars of that caliber, and to just be in England basically, because this is actually the second time that I've appeared in public, in England. So that was, and that's after many years. So that's always interesting, and I couldn't resist seeing this part of the world, because it's so historical. It's got so much ancient history. And the lineup was very good, because actually I am very particular about who I will work with or say yes to when it comes to conferences and radio shows and stuff like that. And Karen's just a very wonderful person, really believes in what I'm doing and gives you the freedom to do your more current work. So it was a great opportunity. Well, we're always working on several things. The last major project was Architects of Control. It's part of a series. It was a DVD that is basically a first of its kind, fusing conspiratorial, content, information, which, after 9/11 now, the world realizes something seriously wrong here, and there's been a big phase shift. But I've been doing this work for many, many years, and my particular approach is to fuse that same kind of material with a kind of a psychological, possibly even philosophical bent, with the desire to point out to people that the kind of dysfunction that they see in the world, the state of decay, is not really about an active, in-your-face tyranny, which is what people in the early stages believe. And believe me, that is going on. But I look at the foundations of all of these things, the roots of tyranny, whether it's of this age or of many thousands of years, with my work on history. And so the psychological aspect comes in when you just try to point out to people in a certain way that, look, there's something that you may be doing in your individual life, in your relationship with yourself, that brings about tyrannical action, and we've been doing work on that. Architects of Control was one look at that, and various other works I've done on this sort of 2012 concept, certainly follow-ups to Architects of Control that I'm making will sort of, elaborate more deeply on that. And it's been really, I'm amazed, it's really been well greeted. People are really digging this, because I thought, oh God, this is going to be a little bit abstract for people, But actually time has elapsed, and people are really up to speed. People have been researching themselves so fast, at such a fast pace. And then with the advent of YouTube and MySpace and all that, there's so much information on the net going around that I always look at that as a very positive thing. And then, therefore, when I put this stuff out, a few years ago, it would have been completely abstract. People would have even completely had a problem with that you even fuse together, conspiracy with psychology. It would have been difficult for them to see where the connections are. But now, people are responsive to it, which it makes my job all the easier, So it's been a very good response. Many reasons for that. One is psychology. One is what David Icke calls the totalitarian tiptoe. And Ralph Ellis refers to as the salami slicing effect, which is a gradual drip feeding of tyranny. Tyranny, as I said, is not in your face. It's not necessarily a jackboot type of control. It's a very surreptitious form of control done over many, many years and decades. To do what? To get people into hive mentality and groupthink, and also to basically, fundamentally, this is how the psychology ties in my work, is to erode a man's sense of selfhood. That people from the religious world would call the soul. But that's kind of a loaded term, so I prefer to use the term self. But basically the spirit of man, the man's sense of independence, is slowly collectivized in the way that many of the people I refer to of the past, scholars, teachers, filmmakers, have always demonstrated and shown. This has been brought up in fantastic series and movies, and still is being shown in some very interesting films that are being shown. And certainly in the work of Aldous Huxley and so many other thinkers who've talked about this particular process. Some speak about it in detail, others speak about it in more general terms. And I want to speak about it specifically. I like to look into the exact roots of why this is happening. And the slow erasure of people's selfhood not only makes them collectivized, but it forces them into hive think, which makes them deeply dependent on the approval of other people around them, and ultimately on the approval of bosses, you see, in the state and the establishment, the politicians and the priests. In other words, the famous authority figures that we all know about. The more you become dependent on these people, and now we're even becoming dependent on what I would describe as technocrats, the builders of the scientific purgatory, the global village. Not that I'm bashing science or technicalness. That's all excellent. I mean, you couldn't have cameras and TV and all of that without it. I'm not speaking about that. I'm speaking about the ideology by which technology and technical things and science is being used in the same process that religion used to do for thousands of years, which is to erode a man's sense of selfhood, to make him think of himself as a sinner, you see, to make him conform to one set of commandments, to envision one kind of heaven for all kinds of people, to repress his natural instincts, to have an antipathy towards the natural world and towards women and animals and so on. Technology has picked up the trowel. It's like the religious people get exhausted building the wall, they're taking a break, and the scientist comes in, picks up the cement and the trowel and goes, oh, we'll finish it off, and they're now continuing to build the wall of the global village. So there's that to take in mind, because this creature that is their product now is only a half self or a third of a self, a very existentially inauthentic person. And also he now becomes dependent on their approval and their money and everything about his life. He's looking to these authority figures. And therefore he has lost so much of his own inner guidance and his own inner understanding that now he has abnegated his own willpower to the leader, to the expert, to the elder, and therefore then able to guide man very easily. In the past we saw this. It's one of the reasons why life in history has taken on the shape that it has done, with the division of continents and all sorts of other faculties. You see, the class system, for instance, is one aspect of this control mechanism. There's many others, the educational systems. This was to soften up our forefathers, pit one group against the other, all of these different kinds of things. Arms race, like between communism and the West. There's many permutations of this. East versus West, affluent societies versus, the primitive societies. All that, there's so many aspects of this. That was to get our forefathers, into that mode where they would become inhabitants of this social hive and slowly erode their identity. Now we're seeing it in a different way. So the architecture of control that exists is entirely based on, rooted in man's own escapism or avoidance of the call of selfhood. And you can't address that matter in a purely conspiratorial alternative research community. Inevitably, you have to enter into the psychological world. And I'm one of the first people to do that in this particular way. It has been touched on by others, of course, but nobody's really done it to the full extent and with the breadth and scope, of the work that we've been doing currently. No, I'm against it. First of all, one has to understand that when they look to the East, it might look all bloody exotic. It might look all exotic, from our perspective of the West, because again, we've been so raped of some of our cultural and traditional roots that the Eastern mysticisms and Eastern yogas and Eastern teachings and religions might look very exotic, as they do to most people who are living in New York City and feeling very cut off. And there's always been these cults of the hippies and other New Age. Now you have all this stuff where they're looking to the East as if it's some sort of solve all. I don't think that way at all. I'm very much a student of the Western magical tradition. So I'm saying, yes, there are magical traditions, there are mystical traditions, but you don't really need to go to the East necessarily. But more importantly than that is we have to fundamentally understand that the kind of Brahmanism, Hinduism, even Sikhism, and certainly the Islamism that we are finding in these Oriental countries is a Christianity of another kind. It's not any better. It's very patriarchal. It's very antithetical to nature, you see. So I don't believe there's that many answers there. In fact, one might say it's even a bit of a distraction. And you brought up the point very well that, in fact, one of its primal doctrines is the abnegation of the ego. Now, which is of course very, very wrong. It's very misgiven. However, we might give a bit of slack by saying that there's a problem here with the semantics, of their definition of what ego is. It's not precisely the same as what the Western concept is. So, one would have to spend a lot of time getting into that, because it is actually fundamental. The Eastern concept of collectivism always has stood in opposition to the Western man's feeling of independence. This is on the surface anyway. On paper, you'd feel that. And if you look at the monkhoods and the priesthoods and the way people live in the East, the self doesn't play a very big role. It's there, but it's the group, it's the tribe, it's the cult, the religion that takes precedence. And I've always had problems with that, both in my personal life and then in other studies. However, the Western system is somewhat the same. You see, they're all under this kind of theocracy, be it the Christianized, versions, Judeo-Christianized versions of the West, or this Brahmanistic, Hinduistic tradition. You study back a bit, and you'll find that, the religions of the East and the West were much more pure. And in fact, they've gone through many periods where they've actually been contaminated. They fall into the hands of very manipulative people right across the board. But getting more to the metaphysical point you're asking, no, I think that the ego is something we need to have in right context. You don't want to karate kick it to death. It's needed. The ego is very much needed. It's almost like the janitor of a large corporation. But he turns on the lights, or, he turns them off at night, he keeps the security, he cleans the floors, The ego is there for a reason. It's not something we need to get rid of, but it must be correctly assimilated. And its job description must be a little bit more defined, And it's almost like the janitor may think of himself as the lord of the corporation at night when the executives aren't there. But when the executives drive up in the morning, he damn well knows his place. And in psychological terms, that's the same thing. When the self, or the spirit of a man, is reintegrated, well, then the ego will do its job, and it'll be well thanked as well. I'm a person who believes that the ego has done a monumental job of keeping consciousness intact. And I've gone into this in my Atlantis book, you see, and other works on the trauma. I believe in ancient times there was a deep traumata that happened to the human psyche, and the ego took birth from this. Not too many thinkers have ever gone into this, but there is elements of the work of Julian Jaynes, you see, that looks into this, that in a very recent period, somewhere between 10 and 13,000 years ago, the earth itself was wrecked by titanic cataclysms. And it's the effect of those that intrigues me, which is the effect on consciousness. This has never been touched on by anyone with the depth that it requires. Man's psyche, what we know as ego consciousness or consciousness, went through an enormous tribulation because of that physical trauma that happened on Earth, be it through comets, so everybody's got their own theory, and be it through disasters and all this kind of thing. And the fossil record tells us that this happened. The Michael Cremows and Graham Hancocks, they all know that this happened. Even mainstream scientists admit that it's happened. And new evidence is always coming out all the time proving that it happened. Recently now in Siberia, new mythologies have been uncovered, texts that confirm that those areas were once called the lands of the dead, the lands of the abyss, inhabited by spectres and ghouls and stuff. And this is a completely common motif you find all over the Nordic countries and Britain, which was at one time not based in romantic ideas. This was their way of describing the carnage and the fossil death, and the enormous fauna mortality. And I pick up with this and go, yeah, but okay, if you believe that, Atlantis and these pre-Diluvian continents were sinking beneath the earth and cataclysms reigned and all of these horrors took place, and as I said, science can now prove that they did, why has nobody ever asked? I mean, man wasn't just sitting in some chair like King Canute letting this all happen in a passive way like he was watching a screen. You go back to the ancient legends of the Indians and the Native Americans and any group, and they're telling you about how the consciousness of man was utterly devastated by this. This is where we have the invention of the devil being a sort of way of interpreting, you see, these natural disasters, the fire demons, the hollow places, the frightening animals, the hybrid creatures, the journey into the underworld, the war between the gods. Something happened in the consciousness of man that can pretty much be dated. And then as I continued researching, I discovered that basically what we are calling the ego today, meaning the kind of consciousness you have when you wake up every morning, has a date of birth. It hasn't been with us eternally. That ties into my work on 2012, where I say, and it might not be with us in the future too, right? But even leaving that aside, its date of birth, I believe, backed up strongly by the work of the great Julian Jaynes, emphasizes that this ego is new, recent. This helps to account for some of the ego's peculiar infantile traits. Well, it is infantile. Expect from a child childish behavior. So all the peculiarities and peccadillos and weird idiosyncrasies that the ego has could be explained by the fact that it's basically about 7 years old at this point, you know. Incredibly efficient, incredibly open, you know, in many ways, but at the same time utterly ruthless and tyrannical, like children are. And then, what the hell has this got to do with conspiracy, Michael? People will say, well, in my work, finally I started to realize that as you study this particular history, the history of psychology, the history of history, my God, what would happen if man being in this traumatized state, if man is a schizoid creature, could not a particular oligarchical power or plutocratic elite that's hell-bent on controlling man, as obvious to anybody who's done 5 minutes of homework, and we can leave the definitions of who they are, royals, Illuminati, Jesuits, Jews, you know, whatever, you know, let's just leave that aside for one moment because that's a whole separate study. If you can understand that there's an architecture or matrix of control, could their control not be occurring because they're already dealing with a schizoid individual who has no center of sovereignty, meaning that his understanding of truth, his understanding of justice, his understanding of personal freedom, and his understanding of security are all fundamentally shaken to the core. Could that creature then be susceptible, you see, to this kind of control? As I studied more, I came to the conclusion that that was the case, absolutely. And therefore, it's not just about some Orwellian jackboot in the face, guns to the head, which of course they can still do and are doing in many places of the world. They're not above it. But they, architects of control, have far more subtle ways of gaining, you know, human beings' complicity, the regimentation, and the conformity, and all of this. They want what's known, I think it was Eric Fromm who said smiling depressives. What Aldous Huxley said is a tyranny without tears, you see. They're already whistleblowing this. A lot of people, a lot of the insiders are always saying, we prefer this. We prefer the remote-controlled creature, as opposed to somebody who's told where to go, told where to sit. You know, we've done that. That's kind of Mark 1 of the slave. We want to have, you know, 2.0, you know, slave 2.0. We want global village. And that's a different kind of slavery. I've also described it, as I did here at the conference, as being chains of gold replace chains of iron. You know, an affluent society, an affluent prison, a decorated incarceration replaces a dungeon. And the danger of that is that this psychically mutilated person goes, this is wonderful, thanks, great. Hail the village, hail the global village, praise the overlords, you see. So they'll have actually a completely willing slave. In other words, the smiling depressive. Well, people's vision of themselves is connecting to everything we've been saying. This is where the real tyranny lies. Tyranny is ultimately psychic in nature. As we said, it has a physical, you know, component. The colonization, the police state, the CCTV cameras, the digital implants. We're not negating any of this, and this has been well covered by myself and many other, you know, scholars in this field. What distinguishes my work right now, at least, and I'm hoping catches on a lot more, is this idea of how man is his own tyranny, how he identifies with these masters, how he has a hierarchy within his own consciousness. And to put it simply, it's this vision of oneself. I describe people as self-murdered or self-hating. Yeah, in psychological terminology, it's sadomasochistic or sadistic types, masochistic types. And if you're masochistic, you inevitably become tyrannical and sadistic to other people. But it's rooted in the idea that your vision of yourself is not really a vision of yourself at all. It's a vision of what, you know, philosophers like George Frederick Hegel would have called the social persona. Of course, he advocated it too. He was all too itching for this. But in many ways, however, he was quite right. And Sigmund Freud's work also showed this, that the neurosis in people, the psychosis in people, the dysfunction in people, and therefore in their relationships and in society, is based on the fact that man doesn't even have a sense of self. And the ego that he's working with is also not personal. It's a social ego defined by all the people around you. We modify our sense of self and our ego identity based on the approval ratings of other people. And we do this unconsciously, we're not even aware of it. Mother wants this, father wants that, I won't get along with these friends of mine at school unless I modify my behavior. Part of this is natural, and part of it's needed, but at the same time it goes too far. And it's what we know basically is conformity. And as I said, it's okay up to a point, because it's called ego acculturation. You're meant to do this. You're meant to acculturate to your society. However, there's a dividing line between a natural expression of this and when it becomes so extreme that now it starts to erode your sense of natural selfhood. In perfect societies, if they ever existed, but in the perfect society, you'd be allowed to do this, but it would be because it would help your selfhood enter into the world, and the society would allow you to express actually your selfhood. In the imperfect society which we have now, it's to erase the selfhood. And Hegel was the kind of person who emphasized this a lot. And I would underline what he's saying by saying, say I ask what you do. You go, well, I drive a taxi. I'm a bus driver. I'm a builder. I'm an architect. Or I'm a housewife. Or I'm a shopkeeper. I'm a street cleaner. Or I'm a painter. Everything that you would say of yourself, 10,000, 100, 1,000 other people will say exactly that. There's many taxi drivers. Right? There's many window cleaners. There's many politicians. There's many philanthropists, whatever you want to call it, deep sea divers, you name it. Just in the same way, go, oh, my name's Michael. Well, that's hardly unique, is it? So this is what I'm talking about. You start to realize that, wait a minute, almost everything that defines me, or I think defines me, is absolutely collective. That's why Big Brother's rubbing his hands going, yes, it is, and that's very important that it is. But then I say, that's okay, don't run away from it, don't fight it, just observe it. And then ask the next question, well, what is it then that makes me truly unique? Well, we're living in a society that has no interest in you finding what is unique, although they have a nice smoke screen to pretend that they're doing that. That's all this chic, politically correct stuff to make you feel, oh no, we're more independent than we've ever been. You can buy 500 different colors of Ferrari. There's 1,000,001 different kinds of coffee places, you see. Oh, you have more diversity than ever. This is mostly a media, I have a whole thing on that, the media memes, the propaganda that comes through the media. But keeping in line with what we've been talking about is that the starting process in all of this is the process of a single human being asking themselves, what is it really that makes me unique? And then I have a subdivision of that, which I went into my Irish Origins DVD. And that is, I know that that's difficult and you probably won't get very far because you might misunderstand what I'm saying. You can't come upon selfhood directly. This thing is almost like a sort of a hall of mirrors in a way. There's a lot of built-in, it's like some sort of Indiana Jones underground labyrinth thing, It's not that easy. There are tricks, and ciphers and things to crack. I'm speaking psychologically. But there is one route to it, and that is to discover what is all that is not the self. And that is apophatic learning. They call it deconstructive, or apophatic processes. Not too familiar in the West. The Germans are pretty good at it because they have a whole, philosophical tradition in this. But in general daily life, this is a bit difficult. The Sherlock Holmes books, there are things in our culture that have gone into this, and there is certain principles of this. People think, oh, you're just talking science. No, there's a big difference, right? This is a psychological model in which you analyze and you think about and you discover all the things that are not the self. There's a teacher called J. Krishnamurti who said, until the false is seen as the false, the truth is not. That's exactly what he was talking about. And there's other models of this as well. And that's what my work is all about, is to try and help people to learn, not to teach them anything, but to help them to learn this process of deconstructive observation. Discover what is false. And that means socially, economically, in all aspects of life, including psychology and the self. That's why my work covers a lot of ground. If you manage to do that, then you're actually cleaning away the briars that stand in the way of the path to this revelation. But that revelation will be an independent one that's done in the privacy of oneself. Discovering the self can't be done in any form of collectivized way. You can't do it in ashrams. You can't do it in churches. You can't do it in think tanks, and you can't do it in round table meetings. It's absolutely a personal, private thing. In fact, you can't do it in families, and even so, you can't do it even in relationships. People have to think about this deeply. You only do it in relationship with yourself. Now, we have the other side. What I've been saying hopefully will help people understand the nature of the architects of control. It'll give them a forensic profile of the architects of control, because they're hell-bent to make sure that that never happens. So almost everything they do, including wars, planes hitting buildings, economic meltdowns, black presidents, and God knows what else you could mention, the whole shebang, is actually designed to continue building the wall between you and selfhood. We don't see that because it's all divided in space and time and all looks mighty, attractive outside. For instance, I've spoken many times about this fact that the rhetoric that politicians use, and I can use specific examples of Al Gore with his whole climate concepts, and the very rhetoric that he uses subtextually, underneath all that talk about global warming, etc., is actually occult in nature. It actually has to do with the psyche of man that is heating up. It's a different kind of temperature and also temperament that he's talking about. But these are the magi, these are the clever Pied Pipers who get on the world stage as what's called the animus, or the male, again, expert. Everybody gathers around them listening to this bogus stuff, but it's tried and true for centuries, you see. So they wave their magic wands, the media helps them to get on the world stage, and then they use this surrogate language. They use this very clever talismanic words, and what it's doing is it's exercising people's inner angst. Because Big Brother has known for a long time, and especially now, that people are falling apart psychologically. And the reasons are because they're not doing their inner work, their soul work or shadow work. Big Brother knows this. It knows it's one of these, liabilities that come with control, is that the hive might start falling apart. At that point when the hive looks like it's disintegrating, or people can't put up with this tyranny anymore, this tyranny without tears, other elements come in to sort of break it down. They're aware of this, they know it. And therefore they need to then glue and galvanize everybody back. When you really deeply study these Bertrand Russell school types, these Orwellian types, you will see from their own works that they do this and that they're very concerned about it. Again, the beginner will find this very hard to believe, but that's neither here nor there. Their actual works show you, they even call it a technocracy of power. And they have many agents doing this. So when you see these people on TV, the Brzezinskis, the Bushes, the Obamas, and all this circus, try to get the pattern recognition to discover what's really happening on a psychological level through the colors they use, through the set designs they use, through the rhetoric that they use. This is as old as Greece, it's as old as Babylon, the rhetoric, the sophistry, the pathos. How they manipulate words and control you. Why? Because they understand that, they want a slavery, but they don't want a psychotic on their hands. And many people do become psychotic. They fall through and they're no longer considered, worthy, so that we've got institutions that sort of take care of them. Some sort of hideous Pink Floyd situation where you become so insane, then they have you as they lock you up. And unfortunately, people have to go through this hideous experience. In order to continue the divorce from people's psyche is many of the things that these people do. They themselves are divorced from their self. That's why they love hierarchy. I've gone into this in great detail in other works. That their own hierarchies, these Illuminati types, these Masonics, they love the symbol of the pyramid, they love this hive mentality because they themselves are psychically, toxically, broken. And they depend entirely on this brotherhood concept. Very anti-feminine, anti-natural aspect of life. And they would seek to impose this. And then when man feels insecure, he does likewise. As I said, he identifies with these leaders. He's not only being glued together, he's willing to get up in line because he's feeling the inner existential angst. So he then lends himself. He starts getting in line. He becomes dependent on the handrails that's provided by these establishments. So when you see trouble in the world, it goes along with the rise of evangelism or the return of a fundamentalist religion, etc. You see, or we have the Islamic fundamentalism. It's exactly the same thing. It's just displaced to another country. But it's exactly the same thing. The fear that has people galvanized back, and God knows what's next. There'll always be something to bring people back to the circus, the Roman circus, you see, to keep people edified and entertained, as Aldous Huxley called it, the bread and circuses. And so this is, again, something that really has to be investigated. But I have a little bit of a problem with those who are investigating it because in my eyes they always leave consciousness at the door. They don't factor that in, as much as I want to do. Yeah, that's a hugely important question because we have to look to the future and wonder what's going to happen if we see this happening now, the state of decay. Can it change, for the positive? It will change for the positive if consciousness is brought into the factor, is factored in. Then I'm very optimistic. If consciousness is left out of the equation and we only try to address these problems politically, sociologically, ecologically, militaristically, and all of these other idioms that we're familiar to use, and even in a superficial psychological way, which is almost the same thing as a New Age way, this has no value. In fact, it may play right into the hands of the tiger. Because remember, you can be chased by a whale or a shark and swallowed because it's chasing you, or it could be standing stock still in the water and you swim into its jaws of your own volition. You're still eating. You can be waiting for the tiger to lead you out of the jungle. Probably not a good thing to do, but we might end up doing that. So a lot of the things that look like solutions today, I have very little faith in and part of, because I'm worried about it. But a healthy, true existentialist return to philosophical and psychological concepts, which is not very difficult. There's all given a stigma. It's actually very simple, very basic. And the discovery that you are a unique person with a unique purpose to be here, and tuning back into that, and a realization of the power of your own selfhood, dividing yourself from the collective as much as you possibly can through your creations and your music and your attitude, realizing that you must do this, as I said, apophatic, get in touch with that type of learning, which is learn to see what is true by, let me put it this way, there's a Conan Doyle statement in which he said, when you have excluded the impossible, whatever remains, no matter how improbable, must be the truth. That's the kind of thing I'm talking about. See the false as the false, and then the truth will make itself appearance to you. It's a cleaning away. It's like a forensic cleansing process. And it's a beautiful process once you start getting into it. Some people have a natural aptitude for it. They usually become detectives and so on and forth. And that's what I'm basically asking people to do, is to become a detective, sort of a Hercule Poirot, if you will, of consciousness. This will help people no end, because there's no point asking somebody to do something a little bit different if they don't feel a sense of natural empowerment from doing it. I recommend these procedures because there's an instant empowerment from it. There's no cold turkey period. There's no, except from the fact that you might have to divide yourself from people that you've foolishly thought were, your guides. I mean, we're habitually asking the misguided for our guidance. I mean, that's obvious that needs to stop. But as you proceed along this particular apophatic, catabolic way, you will find that there's enormous empowerment from it. You'll become really good at it. I try to teach it even to children when I've had the chance. So I believe in it thoroughly. It doesn't mean that you completely negate other things, but it just is a new slant on things, a new way of approaching life that gives you a new set of filters, a new set of tools to work with life. And that becomes very, very empowering. Well, we're also being helped in this process by certain scientific discoveries, many involving the DNA, many involving consciousness itself. And we're starting to, just like the quantum scientists had to discover when they looked into the subatomic particle and everything, that many of the shaman and many of the mystics of the past were quite right in what they spoke about when they talked about the ether or the infinite void and the way that consciousness would interrelate with matter. They were forced to accept, Heisenberg and Rutherford and many of these other people had to accept. Bohm, not Jacob Bohm, but Niels Bohr and Bohm, the other holographic theorists and quantum theorists, had to accept that the mystics of old were right. Now, in the work of people like Bruce Lipton, we're looking at consciousness and realizing that when we talk of things like body, DNA, fate, we are actually talking about consciousness. Not as Michael Tsarion would go on talking about, but in a scientific way. Really hardcore sciences can prove this now. There's many experiments that show this. To the point where they're saying, and rightly so, that DNA is not this Lego set that the media always shows you, that's sort of this construct. That's just an image. That's just a model. That doesn't exist within you, really. What exists within you is vibration, right? Which again is overlaid upon frequency, which is overlaid upon consciousness. So in other words, when they're talking about heredity and genetics affecting your behavior and your life and all of these kinds of things, actually it's the reverse that's true. Consciousness is supreme. Consciousness is supreme, and consciousness is found in humans in the highest form. So DNA, the cells, your fate, all of these things, illness, like I said, destiny and fate, what happens to you, the people that you bring in front of you, the relationships you have, again, as we said in the beginning, your vision of yourself, which will then affect your vision of other people. All of this is rooted in consciousness. And therefore, the person who takes control of their consciousness, cleans their consciousness, like Blake said, the doors of perception. If you cleanse that, then you have absolute sovereignty over the body, and even your genetics and things. And scientists know this all too well. They're just not going to broadcast it to the public and open the door to selfhood, are they? I would go so far, and then the next step, of course, is to say, but there is one slight glitch with this, and that is that consciousness is not all conscious. The psychologists have pointed out, of course, that there's a thing called the unconscious, right? And Bruce Lipton accepts this because he even says that 99.9 something of our conscious is in the dark, so to speak. And the part that we use in everyday life is very, very small amount. I mean, he gives a really very small figure. And yet, there we are, using that tiny, tiny part of ourselves. So then, my work then has a lot of validity because I emphasize, as the psychologists do, that even though consciousness is the prime datum, you have a sensor between your conscious mind, the ego world, and this thing that they call unconscious, for want of a word. That part of the unconscious has been given other names. William Blake called it imagination, and others have called it the spirit or the soul, right? And in fact, that's what it is. It is actually the place where your true selfhood resides. So you can't really have the power we've been talking about until there's some sort of integration between the conscious and unconscious aspects. And again, what have we done? The road has just led us right back to the realm of psychology. So to answer your question in brief then, if we do not, and to re-emphasize what I said, if we do not work with psychology, not academically and all of that, I mean just a person going and studying it themselves and finding what they can get out of it themselves. And this may even include ventures into poetry and art, you see, and philosophy as well. We don't know. Or music, whatever. There's many aspects to this. But unless you do, well, you're going to remain a victim, if not of this tyranny of this age, of some other tyranny that will pop up in its place tomorrow. Like William Blake said, that the fist that crushes the tyrant's head becomes a tyrant in its stead. If you look back through history, it's just been one big wall-to-wall tyranny from thousands of years ago. Babylonians, the history of Iceland, the history of Finland. Let's go back. Take the British colonies, the British Empire. Let's go back, to the Sumerians, the Indians, the Portuguese. Everything in this world has been just one club bashing over somebody's head, or one tyrant replacing another tyrant. And it could be the same in the future. You might have a little more affluence, you might have a little less. You might have a little bit more egalitarianness. Women may have a little bit more freedom. They may not. A little bit more good, a little bit less. But you're talking about one endless process of tyranny. What my work is all about is to end it once and for all. And to do that, you've got to look deeply. I'm not just talking about spring cleaning, you see, and just a sort of superficial cleansing here. I believe in what the Maya talked about. We're in an age of awakening. There's even anecdotes and hints in the Bible and the other scriptures about this. So I very much believe it from my astrological work that this is upon us right now. So we have the chance to radically change the way things are, once and for all. But it's not going to be done if consciousness is not brought to the table, because, of course, it all depends on whether there can be a healthy merging of the conscious and unconscious minds. And it is exactly that premise that the architects of control that I talk about in my work absolutely fear. I get a question a lot, do they fear us? Are they in fear? Yes, and that's the part they're afraid of, is if this starts to work, which is why they've misrepresented psychology to people. They bash all the conspiracy people. They don't want the galvanization of these different subject matters. They're very against it. They've seeded the movement with their own agents, like they did the Christian movement, and to make sure that there's a lot of bickering and fighting and all these kinds of things. So they're very much adept at trying to make sure that this particular message doesn't get out. Because as long as you dive into the pigsty that they've created for you, i.e. the political sphere, the charitable sphere, the social spheres, they know that you're going to go round and round in circles, and you may take one step forward, but you can take 10 steps back. And you're ultimately under their dominion and under their rules, because they've created this dialectic. They've created this, as David Icke says, problem, reaction, solution scenario. They've created the good cop, bad cop scenario. A little bit of good, a little bit of bad, you see. And they know that really nothing ultimately changes. You just have a topical good at the bottom of the pyramid, but the big boys at the top are not in any way threatened. So what I talk about is much more deeply, powerful than that. And it offers us tools to really change the status quo and put an arrow through the, the third eye of these people. Really, it's like see their underbelly and strike hard at the roots of evil rather than at the branches. when we even talk about soul, self, spirit, and so on, we are actually conditioned by theological interpretations of those things. So it would be wonderful in a perfect world if we could look at these words, you see, without that baggage. But given that we can't and we just have to use those terms, then the only thing I could say is that the soul has been presented to us as if it's something we're given at the time of birth. This is all over the world. Religion, you're born as a human being and you have that spark of God, and you can lose your soul. Right? If you don't do the right stuff, you know, he's lost his soul, or this person. And even I use those. You know, we slip into this. We use these types of terms. Actually, we're not even really right at all. The psychologist Thomas Szasz said it in one sentence. He said, the soul is not something that you find or that you have been given. It is something that you create. Once you truly understand this principle, the whole perception of yourself and your life and your purpose on this life and your relationships with other people will fundamentally change for the better. Even though it sounds as heretical as you could get. But we need to grow up. The human race needs to now wake up and grow up and get it. Because the world is moving already. You're going to get this whether you like it or not. These concepts are going to be taught to us through, you know, being dragged, or you can accept it. But if you accept that the soul is something you are creating, and you are the sole creator of it, and you create it in what we call life through experience, a different kind of gratitude, a different kind of reverence arises. And also what arises, well, it helps us with that whole thing of separating ourselves from the crowd, which I said was important earlier. That's one of the things that will really help you do that. And secondly, what it really means is that no one else can really help contribute to that. Because, of course, that person has to deal with developing their soul, which is different from yours. So immediately you've broken this consensus trance. You may look to other people as guides, as I do. I've got my heroes, I've got my, you know, mentors. But I realize that they're guides. The teaching doesn't belong to them. They can't territorialize it. You know, but they may present an aspect of the teaching, you see. Just like, you know, the facets of a diamond, you know, reflect different aspects of light. So that's okay, that's fine. They're presenting their cuisine in a different way, you know. But never lose sight of the fact that you are in the very process of creating your soul, and the agonies that you feel, and the sorrows, and the feelings of loss, and the euphoria that you feel, and the ecstatic and the peak experiences, and the relationship that you have with music, and with animals, and nature, and human beings. All of this is you taking that lump of clay that was given to you, and trying to turn it into this beautiful thing of your own creation. What most people have done, it just underlines what we've been talking about, is they go, oh, I can't be bothered with all that, getting the hands dirty. I'll stand back and bring in an expert. He's a good sculptor, let him try it. Or, hey mate, can you do it? They go, oh, sure. And everyone is modeling everybody else's clay. And that's the pigsty that we're in right now. Nobody is doing everything. So what you basically have is this hideous, abstract thing, ready for the New York Metropolitan Museum of Art, by the way. Some hideous monstrosity, like something out of Alien, the movie, of this, you know, distorted, multifaceted, you know, papier-mâché thing that's got everybody's stamp on it. You know, I pointed out at the conference that there's this logo downtown that says, I am what I am because of everyone. So some, you know, corporate logo. This is what is being pushed. And basically, we can collude in that by saying, oh, that's just too much work, all that shadow work, soul work, oh, you know, let the religious priest do it. Let me be guided by a strict set of fixed codes, and that I have a fixed heaven waiting for me. I have a savior that can be accepted by all. Or no, I'm an atheist, a scientist, I deal in facts. Even though philosophers like David Hume have said the entire basis of science, which is causality, is utterly a hypothetical construct of the mind. Right? Well, we don't want to mention that, right? So, you know, this process of leaving other people in control, abnegating your own control, and then everybody doing it to everyone is where we are now. They call it multiculturalism, global diversity, you know, they've got all these wonderful terms for it. And it's all based, as I said, as was the Calvinist model, as is this Pavlovian behaviorist model, as is most religious models, including Scientology and Masonry and all of the things that you're seeing in the world, all the things we try to deal with in our work. It's all to drag you away from selfhood. And I've decided in my work to start talking about this because otherwise you're just a basher. You're just, hey Michael, you know, you critique this, you critique that, you know, and a lot of people do this. And it's fine. It has its place. But very importantly, you have to start saying, you know, I'm pointing out the deconstructive stuff here that you need to be aware of, but you have to sort of offer something to replace that. Yeah. That's a very crucial aspect of this. Otherwise, it sort of becomes just finger pointing, you know, which is only about 50% of the problem. You know. Well, we plan to do continue the architecture control. Well, I mean, there's many things going on, but we can plan to continue that, and then we get all this positive feedback about it. It really opened a lot of doors, so now we're really enthusiastic about it. We've been filming all over the world with great, in fact, here in Bath and England, you know, hoping to use a lot of this imagery, and basically just continue this whole novel connection between psychology and conspiracy, so that people are brought up to speed on this. Because again, you have to remember that people don't have the 30 years, you know, that I've put in, or other teachers have put in, scholars, researchers. You know, we have so much meltdown in the world, and people have little time. But they also have the great passion to learn this at the same time. So they're kind of in a bit of a quandary. So I'm very conscious of that, and we try to put the DVDs together, and the books and websites and forums and things, and interviews and so on, so that people can sort of in a compressed, quick way, you know, get hold of some of these very, very esoteric matters. And get hold of it, because they do have the passion, they really do, and they love it. So we're hoping to continue that series and other things as well, you know, through the different months and years, and work on other projects. And for me, it's fundamental to never lose sight of this concept of how selfhood is important in this, how consciousness, how shadow work, you know, fits into all of this, and basically the power of consciousness itself. Yeah. That you can change your reality based on the way you think and your attitude, as long as you know, use these principles, philosophical and psychological principles. Then you have nothing to fear, because you will be in your center, and no matter what kind of meltdown happens around you, you will be guided. You know, not by some hidden mysterium behind the clouds, but an inner voice. You know, children have it. You know, we used to have it. It is innate within us, and so this is all about doing that. Is making a human being take absolute control and dominion over their own life, and that's, you know, goes through stages. That you don't get it right away. You know, it has its own process. And the works that I create, the films I'm doing, you know, really try to focus on this as much as possible. Yeah, I love it. Dangerous Man. That suits me down to the ground. This is the kind of work I'm really suited for, so that's an apt title for me, all right.
Or is it that famous line, I will not be pushed, filed, stamped, indexed, briefed, debriefed, or numbered? My life is my own. And my personal favorite is everyone votes for a dictator. But anyway, I'd like to finish with a quote from Karen's wonderful book. And forgive me if you've heard this before. I just think it needs to be reread. And it's from Aldous Huxley, from Brave New World Revisited, and it's this. It is perfectly possible for a man to be out of prison, and yet not free, to be under no physical constraint, and yet to be a psychological captive, compelled to think, feel, and act as the representatives of the national state or of some private interest within the nation wants him to think, feel, and act. The nature of psychological compulsion is such that those who act under it or under constraint remain under the impression that they are acting on their own initiative. The victim of mind manipulation does not know that he is a victim. To him, the walls of his prison are invisible, and he believes himself to be free. That he is not free is apparent only to other people, because his servitude is strictly objective. Anyway, again, thanks for being here, and thanks for listening. I hope you enjoy the conference. I think, Karen, did you have